Good day, everybody. My name is Bill Tarrant. I head up the marketing function here at GRC Solutions. Welcome to this webinar. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are seated today for GRC Solutions here at number 1 York Street. It's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Thanks for coming today. A couple of bits of housekeeping first. Please feel free to ask questions by using the question function at the bottom of your screen. We will get to questions if we can. The presenters will see the questions coming up, and if any questions are answerable straight away, they'll probably be able to see those and respond to them. We'll try and have time for questions again at the end of the presentation. Any questions we don't get to are recorded, and if you haven't asked them anonymously, we'll be able to send you an email in response to them. Any problems, use the question pane to let me know as well. The webinar is being recorded, and we hope to have the recording available to send out to you possibly by the middle of next week. It takes a little time to edit these recordings, take out the mistakes that I've made and make me look a lot, maybe 20 years younger if it's all possible. Photoshop can do amazing things these days. We are partnering with Arctic Intelligence to produce this webinar today. Arctic Intelligence is Australia's RegTech of the Year, and it's RegTech Exporter of the Year for this year as well. It has over 220 clients in a dozen countries, or more than a dozen countries now, I think, Ali. And all these clients rely on Arctic Intelligence for their financial crime risk assessments. GRC Solutions has been working with Arctic Intelligence for, I think it's around 4 years now. We've been partnering with them to offer their AML Accelerate product, which is an AML program monitor system, which a number of our clients use and are extremely happy with. But they've now developed a risk assessment platform and broadened the focus, and it includes other financial crime domains such as fraud, anti-bribery and corruption, sanctions, modern slavery, human trafficking. Arctic Intelligence is currently building, and this I think you'll find interesting, solutions for climate change and information security risk assessments. And as you know, most of you people are from ADIs, and as you understand, APRA is now starting to put a greater and greater focus on financial, at least climate risk, climate change risks for ADIs. Ali Zahabi, who is going to run this webinar for Arctic Intelligence, is their Asia Pacific Director. And he's got 15 years of experience in sales and leadership across various industries, including data, technology, procurement, risk, and due diligence. He's a graduate of UNSW. Don't hold that against him. You know, those of us who went to Sydney, I mean, you know. Anyway, look, I taught at UNSW for 10 years, so I suppose I should be more friendly about it. He's got majors in finance, accounting, and economics. His career spans various sectors, including banking, insurance, construction, and credit bureaus. He's passionate about helping businesses to effectively manage risk. So Ali, with a pedigree like that, will be glued to our seats. We'll be avid to hear what you have to say. So over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you all for taking the time to spend some time with us, GRC and Arctic, and our partners that I'll be introducing shortly. So Arctic Intelligence, just to echo some of Bill's words, we're very proud to have worked with the GRC for a number of years now, and a lot of, we've got, as Bill mentioned, hundreds of clients around the world, very strong presence in Asia Pacific, and a lot of that initially particularly was in partnership with GRC, which continues to grow from strength to strength. And as Bill mentioned, one of the key objectives of this session is we want to give you an update on financial crimes. Particularly, we're going to focus on fraud, but we'll also touch on anti-money laundering and some other risk domains. We're going to hear from an industry expert on financial crimes, being Adam Sims, which I'll introduce to you in a moment. Then you'll see a demonstration from myself of our risk assessment platform. Many of you are already familiar with Arctic Intelligence and our anti-money laundering platform called AML Accelerate. And it's a fantastic tool. Concurrent to that, as Bill mentioned, we've got a tool which is now being used by some of Australia's largest institutions called the Risk Assessment Platform, through which you've got access to a range of other risk domains. And then we'll hand over to Andrew Tierney, who will be telling us about the movement from a manual spreadsheet solution that compliance professionals have been using traditionally to a more software-focused solution, and the efficiencies that come with that, as well as a few other things coming from a client and a user's perspective, which Andrew is. So a bit of an introduction before I hand over to Adam. I'll tell you a bit about Adam, and it is quite an impressive resume. So Adam is a forensic partner at BDO and a financial crimes solicitor. Prior to joining law, he spent 20 years as a career police detective doing a range of specialist roles, including fraud, which is very relevant for today, and counterterrorism, which is also relevant in terms of AML-CTF. Adam has since held roles at KPMG Forensic, at CBA, IAG, ACCC, and then ended up at PwC before coming across to BDO. Interestingly, in 2009, Adam was one of the selected industry experts to work on the Standards Committee, making changes to the Australian Fraud and Corruption Standard AS 8001, which was released recently. Adam's also recently been selected on the International Standards Committee for Internal Investigations, which has just commenced. Before I hand over to Adam, I'll just also mention, I think there might be a couple of poll questions that Bill will be releasing at different stages during the presentation. So just take note that we'd love to get some information from you guys, which helps us better understand what your needs are. There'll also be at the end of the presentation an opportunity for questions and answers, where you can present a question to any of the panel, and we'll either be able to answer it, hopefully, between us, or take it on notice and come back to you. Okay, without further ado, over to Adam to give us an industry update regarding fraud. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, thanks, Ali, and thanks everyone for having me today. They say there are 3 jobs you don't want. One of them's the Prime Minister of Australia. I'm sure there are people that want to have that job. The other one, or the other 2, I should say, one being a director of a Australian ASX listed company or private company, and the other being a senior executive of a public entity or government department. I think you can see why. Interestingly, not since the GFC have company directors faced such a challenge as the one confronting them now. There's two threats really to companies. There's one being the COVID threat, where we're seeing a lot of companies fold. They're under a lot of pressure. And then there's the other one where companies are going through massive organic growth and simply can't keep up with the governance requirements that they should. The regulators too are under scrutiny, which is interesting. And the regulatory front the regulatory front line, I should say, is really advancing. The regulators have been in the crosshairs of the Royal Commissions, as you're probably all aware, and some other inquiries that have been around. And as a consequence, we are seeing enforcement action on the uptick with the likes of the ACCC, AUSTRAC, and I mean, both of those have arguably been pretty strong in the past, but also ASIC and APRA, who copped a little bit of criticism in a couple of the inquiries. They're all zeroing their sights in on government's arrangements, and particularly around criminal behaviours. Then if you throw litigation concerns into the mix, then reputational concerns into the menagerie of risks as well. We see some significant drivers for more executive scrutiny on governance issues, particularly in matters involving corporate crime. And then if that wasn't enough, you've got Parliament, which is also looking closely at this. So presently, I don't know if you're all aware, there's a piece of legislation in Parliament, Federal Parliament, called the Crimes Legislation Amendment Combating Corporate Crime Bill, I think it's called. If passed, that's going to see some reforms to the corruption space. In particular, there's going to be something called adequate procedures. You may or may not have heard about that. So in terms of governance arrangements, that pretty much is what companies put in place to meet the requirements, not only of the legislation, but it acts as a defence to a potential charge of corruption. So you know, the government's really looking at upping the ante in terms of companies and the expectation around them having governance arrangements in place. There's also a draft guidance if that concerns you. You know, the legislation's not here yet. I expect it to go through. I couldn't give you a time frame on that. I've got that wrong too many times in the past. But the government's got a really interesting read on adequate procedures. So just Google that, Commonwealth Government. It's a very good document. Gives you a lot of guidance around what they may look like. And the big takeaway for me is around risk assessments, which is completely relevant to what we're here to talk about today. So, you know, if you're conducting yourself in line with what you're supposed to be doing in terms of your risk assessment process, then you kind of tick the box, one of the boxes for the adequate procedures. And then lastly, you know, we're here to talk about AML as well. So we've got the Senate committee at the moment discussing what we've all been calling tranche 2 in the past, so the designated non-financial businesses and professions. You know, there's some expectation that there'll be movement on that front too. So it's all happening, I guess you could say. So what are the stats saying? It's all right to talk about these things, but you know, what are the various statistics pointing to? And I'll let you read those. I won't talk to those in any great detail. Not surprising, that's ACFE, international. Pretty much all of them that are coming out, a lot of the big four, they're all pointing to the same thing. Crime's on the uptick, no doubt about that. There's no surprises there with that. You know, people are desperate. People are feeling isolated, feeling scared. It's still occurring. You know, criminals are leveraging that and desperation and that unfolding chaos that really is a cause of or resulting from the COVID situation. Now, the other thing is technology is being used like never before to facilitate crime, with cybercrime on a significant increase. And this area is getting increasingly complicated when you start looking at state sponsors, such as it's been alleged that China and Russia are involved, you know, providing safe harbors to the perpetrators. So we live in a complex world. In terms of the fraud, the increase in fraud, we're seeing not only as a result of COVID, the weaknesses in controls leading to significant frauds, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but you know, things like new crime types, counterfeit of medical supplies and medication, a lot of government stimulus fraud out there. There's you know, fake charities, investment scams, you know, they're countless. In the cybercrime space, you know, malicious links being sent by email, text, acting as health department, tax department. You know, I've even seen one where they're acting as AUSTRAC. Pretty blatant activity. Ransomware attacks, you know, they're going through the roof as well. We've seen a lot of those, and you know, unfortunately, the more vulnerable, so the older citizens are proving to be the group that are being most affected by this. And then, you know, really disconcertingly, we're seeing things like human exploitation, trafficking, worker exploitation. You know, there was an increase in child exploitation during the COVID, which was an interesting statistic, but not surprising, I guess, given the reliance on computers and other things. So, you know, Donald Creasy's fraud triangle there really is highlighting what I consider, and others that I've read about, to be the perfect storm. There's been many comparisons to what's happening now to the GFC in 2008, and I guess the takeaway for me is, I think there's a lot of differences too, but the takeaway for me is we saw a huge increase in corporate crime cases surfacing. You know, at the time, if I think back to it, some that caused the crash, but even more significant were the ones that came post crash, and that went on for, you know, a long time afterwards, and we're still seeing, which is frightening, fraud from that time. So what I wanted to touch on here is just some of the chief governance concerns that we're witnessing, just to provide a bit of guidance around this. I guess the key question you would have saw from the first slide is, you know, executives have a lot to think about, and not every organisation will be affected by every one of those risks. So how do you start to identify or really realise the risks to start with. Most important is a documented process, and fundamental to all this is the risk assessment. I'm sure there's no surprises there. Risk scanning, and particularly starting with an environmental business scan. For example, not all businesses face, as I said earlier, fraud risk. And then how do you determine whether you face, for example, corruption risk or modern slavery risk to your supply chain, or even sanctions risk? That's where the environmental scan comes in. And it's extremely important. Interestingly, what I see anyway is that not a lot of companies are doing it particularly well, or regularly, or sometimes not at all. The risk assessment is the key feature. It's sometimes not understood, but the big trap I've really witnessed recently is that it's done and it's forgotten about. It's not revisited ever. So I've seen, in fact, in the past 6 months, I saw one that was 10 years old, and the company thought it was still up to date. So I've been talking a lot about the onset of COVID and the remote workforce, which in many cases dynamically altered the existing controls that were in place. And the company I just spoke about was one of those. An example is one client we had where they had the classic controls in place around the finance function. When COVID occurred, that was eviscerated overnight, laying an approval mechanism for just one person where it had existed for 3 previously. What that resulted in for that particular client was an 8-month fraud, and it cost the client $750,000. In another instant, we had a client with procurement controls which were relaxed, and what occurred there was a layoff of a key control staff member, effectively allowing one person to manipulate procurement records, which unfortunately occurred, and that resulted in I think it was about a $450K fraud. And then another example which comes to mind was the reliance on third-party providers. So there was a lot of devolvement around third-party suppliers. Supply chain was kind of thrown into chaos with COVID, and as a result, some companies really were required to go out and find new suppliers, and it was really a matter of getting them in the door quickly. In one case, we saw where, again, the controls were reduced due to COVID, and as a result, there was collusionary behaviour. This individual, who was a procurement director, saw the opportunity to get some friends in to the business. The contracts were far in excess of what they'd been paying previously, and this guy was getting kickbacks. So lose-lose for that company. But all of these could have been realised risks before they became realised frauds. That's the key message here, had the risk assessment process been revisited. Remember, at the end of the day, it's designed to reduce criminal behaviour, and it's definitely an area that that you really don't want to get wrong, and I can tell you from experience. The other one out of all those I'd like to highlight is the culture of compliance. So business culture. It's a key factor that's emerging. We've been talking about it for a long time, but that's about having the right governance in place. Not only having the right governance in place, but having the right message, which is toned from the top. So there's a big responsibility to senior management and board, and we're seeing that emphasis be placed on these individuals by the likes of the new fraud and corruption standard that I was a member of, and was key to the uplift in that recently, as well as the government inquiries that we've seen. There's a big emphasis on pushing responsibility to board, and that all comes back to culture. So there's a lot of changes in place. Just get you to be mindful of that. But again, I think central to all these themes is the fact that the risk assessment is the most important process. That's me, Ali. Thank you. Hopefully I kept within my 10 minutes.
You sure did, Adam. It was fantastic. Thank you for that. Awesome to get an update from one of the leading experts in Australia, someone who's relied on by various committees to provide advice as to how the standards should be developing in the area of fraud. And a range of key takeaways there, but there's no doubt fraud is occurring. It is something that needs to be taken seriously. The frequency and the depth, so the volume and the value of fraud is increasing, and there's a range of data that supports that. And Adam certainly gave you some examples there. And risk assessments are a crucial part of the process. One of a a range of things that should be considered. Before we continue, a couple of things. One is please feel free to send through any questions. So through the Q&A, and I know Bill is monitoring those and responding to them. I know there's one technical issue that Bill's addressed. Any other questions, even questions you'd like to put to the speakers, please feel free to send them in. We'll either get to them during the presentation or during the questions and answers. And also, Bill, would you like to do the first poll? I'm putting you on the spot, Bill, but let me know if this is, here it is. So this is the first question.
Don't put me on the spot, Ali. I'm way ahead of you.
Thanks, Bill. So a pretty sort of simple question here, and that is, are you confident in the controls you've got in place for fraud risk? So, one of the things, Adam mentioned risk assessments. When you do a risk assessment, it essentially means looking at the risks and then looking at the controls you've got in place to guard against those risks. And a control could be as simple as doing an ID check. It could be as simple as providing training to your team to make them aware of fraud. So the question is, are you confident in the controls you've got? Yes or no, or unsure?
You could have asked the question, how many people know what cuckoo smurfing is?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's maybe one for the Q&A. Adam on the spot with that one. Okay, so have we got this? Can you publish the results yet, Bill, or do we come back to them?
Yeah, look, I think the rush of answers has ended. So I'll just end the poll and it'll publish. Share the results.
Okay, great. So the majority are confident, which is great. And a few of you aren't confident, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that you need to do, we need to maybe spend some time going through and suggesting some controls. And then a few of you are unsure. So also we'd love to just catch up with you and just sort of have a free consultation to see how we can assist. Okay, great. And please feel free to reach out to us, particularly in any of those baskets, but particularly no unsure, and we'd love to just catch up with you and have a chat. Okay, so this is where I give you a presentation, a demonstration of the risk assessment platform. Before I share my screen, as I mentioned earlier, essentially Arctic Intelligence over the last 5 or 6 years has predominantly focused on anti-money laundering risk assessments and predominantly delivered through a platform called AML Accelerate. And quite a number of you that are on the call today are users of AML Accelerate. We've been developing, because of demand, essentially because of feedback from the market, we've been developing a platform which was first released a couple of years ago. I think our first client started using it a couple of years ago, and it's maturing now. We've got quite a number of large, sophisticated clients that are getting good use out of the risk assessment platform. What RAP does, so RAP for short, because we don't have a great imagination at Arctic, but we do other things very well, but not creative in terms of the name of the platform. So RAP, what RAP does is it gives you the ability to conduct a range of risk assessments in a range of domains, anti-money laundering being one of them, but also fraud, and also, as Bill mentioned earlier, areas such as modern slavery, human trafficking, anti-bribery and corruption, sanctions. And we're also developing the ability to do risk assessments in climate change and in information security. So please, particularly in the latter two, if you're interested in climate change, information security, we'd love some live partners to work with to help us really polish off those models that are almost finalized and ready to be released. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll share my screen, and you've got to be patient with me because whenever I share my screen, it's never perfect. I'm gonna turn off my camera, which often helps, and then I will share my screen. Bill, can you give me the ability to share my screen?
Should have it, Arnie.
Here we go. Yep, got it. Yes, it's just my there
we go.
Yep, there we go. Okay. So this is the risk assessment platform. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a range of domains that you can have a look at. Obviously, AML being one of them. You can do AML at the customer level, at the product risk assessment level. You can do it at the enhanced customer due diligence level. You can look at fraud risk, which I'm going to get into in a moment in more detail. There's anti-bribery and corruption, correspondent banking. So there's something called the Wolfsburg principles that the banks have to adhere to when they transfer money to each other, particularly when they're international transfers. Wildlife trafficking, modern slavery, sanctions. So there's a whole menu of different risk assessments that you can utilize. I will only go into fraud today, but if you'd like to see a demonstration on any of these other risk domains, I would love the opportunity to provide you that demonstration. I spend most of my days giving these demonstrations, so I love the opportunity to give you a demonstration. Now I'll jump into fraud and show you what it looks like. And this will be the express version, okay? I'm going to keep it to sort of 10 or 15 minutes, but it'll give you enough, hopefully, of an insight to see if you're interested to have a deeper look. The way it's set up is that you can have multiple divisions. I'll assume you've just got one division for now, but if you did have multiple, it gives you the opportunity to assess each of your divisions separately, and then it aggregates into an enterprise level rating and report. Okay, I'll go into the fraud model to show you what it looks like. Some of the features of the model are very consistent regardless of which domain you select. So for example, if you're doing an anti-money laundering risk assessment or a sanctions risk assessment, you'll see some of these sections in those assessments as well. So these chevrons represent a different section of the assessment. There's the context, workflow, the risk analysis, controls assessment, and then the report. And if we begin with the end in mind, you input a range of data to produce a rating, which I'm going to show you straight away. Someone wise once told me to begin with the end in mind. So the reason why you're inputting this data is to get a report, to get a rating for your business. And in this instance, this particular business has got a medium residual risk rating, okay, medium. And this division of this business has got a high inherent risk. So Adam mentioned early on conducting a risk assessment. So in this instance, this business unit has a high inherent risk. Its control effectiveness has been assessed as adequate. And the residual risk, when you consider inherent risk and control effectiveness, the residual risk is a medium. And then you've got a range of risk areas that are assessed by the platform. So each risk area is assessed and rated, both in terms of inherent risk, which is what you're seeing here, and then in terms of controls. So then you assess your controls by each of these areas, which all adds up in aggregate to a medium residual risk. So now that we've seen what you're producing, let's go back and see how you produce it. You start with the context, and the context is pretty simple. It's what's the purpose, what's the scope, what are the limitations, either as an executive summary or as a detailed context. It's most of you who produce reports will be very familiar with the fact that no reports produced without there being an executive summary at the start of that report that covers these areas. So whatever you type into these sections appears in that report. For those of you who've got exposures to countries other than Australia, naturally, any financial crime risk assessment, whether it's fraud or anti-money laundering or any of the others, you need to consider country risk exposure. And so the model has got inbuilt country risk ratings. Okay, some of you won't be interested in that. Some of you will be very interested in this. So if you are, it's good to be aware that Arctic Intelligence, one of the things we do is that we continuously monitor a range of sources of country risk ratings. For example, we look at the United Nations sanctions listings. We look at Transparency International. We look at the Kimberley Principles. We look at the Financial Action Task Force country ratings. So all you've got to do here is input all the countries you've got exposure to, and then it gives you a rating for each of those. And you also receive email alerts whenever those ratings change, okay? So we continuously monitor those sources. We will alert you by email to whenever those country ratings change and what's driven those changes. Okay, Workflow, one of the features of the risk assessment platform is workflow management. So if you're a chief risk officer, or if you're head of compliance, if you're a team leader, if you're interested in managing the workflow of your team, it's good for you to be aware this platform allows you to have multiple individuals listed as users, and then you can monitor and assign risk factors for assessment or controls for assessment. So you can assign individuals, list the individuals, assign tasks to those individuals, and then monitor the progress of those tasks. So in this instance, for example, we've got Patricia that's set up as an approver. We've got myself set up as an assignee. So I've done some work. I've assessed 29 risks. I've been quite busy actually. Some of them require Patricia's approval, and some of them are awaiting her approval. And so the system has an inbuilt approval process, which I'll touch on a little bit, but it's good for you to be aware of it. Okay. Now, this risk assessment chevron is where the real work starts. Okay, the work that contributes towards those ratings I showed you earlier on. And so we're focusing on fraud, but this could be anything. Each of our models has got different sections relevant to those models. Okay, so for anti-money laundering, you'd see assessment of channels and products, and geographies, etc. You know, the FATF principles for AML. In this instance, we're looking at the fraud, the risk factors appropriate for fraud. I'll expand all just so you can see. As you can see, each of these subsections has got a range of areas that we've developed with decades of experience and with the assistance of experts such as Adam, areas that need to be assessed in order to have a comprehensive assessment of your fraud risk. So you can see there a range of areas that be relevant to you, whether it's in personnel. I think Adam touched on procurement fraud. There's a whole range of areas of fraud that need to be assessed in order to get a comprehensive understanding. I'll go into a couple of them to show you what it looks like, to show you what it feels like to answer some of these questions. But what I'll do before that is I'll show you the sort of dashboard. So this is a dashboard of all the fraud risks. And remember, you're seeing here a demonstration. You're seeing here a model that's already progressed. Okay, so based on the input to date on this model, you can see a dashboard of the risks to date. Okay, which is appropriate for anyone really using the platform, or particularly at that team leader level, or chief risk officer, or financial crimes manager, compliance manager, that sort of, or even at the board level. If you log in, you want to have a look at, well, show me to date where are the risks and where are the areas that we need to quickly focus on. And you can see here, ID theft is an extreme risk. Intermediary account compromise is an extreme risk, whereas leave forms are a low risk. So the HR team's done a good job in those controls. So you can use it as a benchmark. So it gives you a quick sort of snapshot. Now I'll go into a couple of them and show you what it looks like. If there's any questions, please raise your hand and Bill will alert me, and then that will help guide the presentation. I'll go into ID theft because that's one that's always very topical and very exciting for a lot of our clients, and very well known. You know, when I ask generally, you know, what do we know about fraud risk? The answer generally is, well, you know, ID fraud, ID theft. Everyone's quite scared about having their ID compromised. Okay, so we simply ask some very basic questions. What's the likelihood? So of ID theft, there's a bit of a description of what ID theft is. What's the likelihood of ID theft occurring in your business? So we provide you the tools. We rely on your judgment to input the answers. I'll show you a bit later on how you can substantiate your answers and validate and demonstrate your answers. But at this stage, we're asking simply using your professional judgment and by consulting with other experts in your business, what's the likelihood that ID theft will occur in your business? Is it guaranteed? In which case it's certain, and so there's a description for each of these labels. Is it very likely, which means almost certain, essentially? You can see here the definitions for each. Is it likely, which means high probability, or is it unlikely, or is it rarely going to happen? And so you've got to use your judgment to input these answers. And then the impact. So again, we're asking here, if you had no controls, okay, if you had no ID checking, if you had no training for your staff, how likely will it be that ID theft will occur in your business? And let me tell you from experience, if you are a bank, or if you are taking deposits, or providing withdrawals to people of their funds, or facilitating transfer of funds, or even if you're a casino, essentially, and you're allowing large wagering, if you don't have controls in place, these answers are going to generally be guaranteed. I can guarantee you that there will be a segment of the population in every country that will quickly identify, pardon the pun, but they will identify the fact that you don't have ID checks or controls, and they will exploit you, and you will be guaranteed to have losses, probably large losses, if they're aware that you don't have those checks. And there's examples. I mean, some very public examples of some of our major banks being defrauded. Just type in, CBA fraud onto Google, or Westpac fraud onto Google. Two of our largest companies, two of Australia's biggest 5 companies in Australia, have suffered the consequences of sort of those not having the right controls in place. What's the impact? Impact has got, again, these labels. Each label has got a definition. We're simply asking you, if it was to occur, is it insignificant, or is it low, moderate, major, or severe? Using your professional judgment with some labels for each. Okay, now you can leave some commentary. This is where you start to substantiate your answers, because in the instance of an audit, whether you're audited by a compliance committee, whether you are externally audited by BDO or equivalent, if you're audited by a regulator, particularly in the case of anti-money laundering, they're going to, one of the questions they'll ask you is, great that you're using this model, the methodology is great, etc., but show me some substantiations to demonstrate these answers. Why is it insignificant? How have you come to that conclusion? So leaving commentary helps. So this is on every page in the model, it allows you to leave a comment, but also, more importantly, you can add an attachment. Okay, and attachments is where you can really substantiate and document your answers. And those attachments appear as a hyperlink in the report. I'm not going to spend too much longer, because I want to cross over shortly. A few minutes, I'll cross over to Andrew for him to give his presentation, but I just want to give you sort of a flavor for how the platform is set up. So you simply go into each of these areas, you answer the questions regarding impact and likelihood, you attach some documents, you add some commentary, and it gives you the outcome here, low, based on the answers you've said. It's a low risk. You can also create actions and assign them to your team. I'll just quickly hover over these list of fraud questions just to show you the different areas that we're asking you to consider. So there's customer account fraud, falsifying working papers, fraud in hiring contractors, which is one of the areas Adam mentioned, because procurement fraud is one of the easiest ways for internal staff members to defraud a business that doesn't have the right controls in place. And I've seen instances where businesses have, after getting a list of their suppliers and conducting ultimate beneficial ownership tests on each supplier, they've seen some matches between them and their staff database. So there's some simple examples there's some simple controls you can do to see if there's relationships between your staff members and suppliers. Doesn't mean there's fraud, just means there's a relationship there that needs to be carefully understood and controlled. Because if it isn't, there's always going to be a segment of the population that might choose to exploit that lack of control. So there's all these risk areas that need to be considered. Go into each one, answer the questions, attach documents. Now I'll go into controls. So once you've gone into risks, naturally the next step is to go into controls. And there are a range of controls that we suggest need to be considered for fraud. So one of the features of the platform is it provides you a fraud library of controls. So within the software, there's a control library, and some of our clients actually use Arctic because it helps them understand the different types of controls the industry is using for different risk domains. So as you can see, there's controls around responsibility structures, ethical frameworks, senior management committee commitments, fraud awareness. Very simple, but surprising that there is a number of businesses around Australia that don't have training for fraud for their staff. The last thing you want is after fraud occurs, you then establish that the staff members that allowed the fraud to occur, sometimes unwittingly, often unwittingly, may not have been trained, may not even understand the types of fraud or understand the way the fraud actually occurred. And had they been trained, it may well have helped raise the red flag before the loss was incurred, the financial loss and reputational damage that comes along with it. So there's a whole range of fraud awareness controls, and there's others in our library as well. We've just got a few in our demonstration account. Third-party due diligence, fraud control strategies, and a range, internal controls, etc. So I'll go into a couple of them just to show you how to answer the questions. And again, keep in mind, we're just looking at fraud controls here. If this was anti-money laundering, you'd have a set of controls appropriate for anti-money laundering. Or if it was sanctions or modern slavery or climate change, you'd have a range of controls appropriate in the platform. So the platform is set up quite similarly for each of those different risk domains. I might go into fraud awareness because we've been talking about it, and we'll go into induction training as a control. And we simply ask, is induction training provided that includes fraud and corruption? And now we ask, how well is it designed? Again, we're asking you for your judgment. We're giving you a model, we're giving you a methodology, but we can't do the work for you in terms of conducting the control testing or interpreting the control testing results. We're asking you to test those controls. For example, in this instance, we're giving you an example here of what a test of that control is. We're saying, does your business have induction training program, including a session on fraud and corruption, awareness and code of conduct? So if you're answering this question, you're simply needing to go to your appropriate registers and seeing, well, who started with your business? If you're part of a bank or part of a casino or money remitter or currency remitter, simply, do you have a new starter that's commenced with your business over the last 12 months? Get a list of those new starters and establish, did they have an induction training session? And did that induction training session include fraud? And then if you want to dig a bit deeper, you can establish who gave that fraud training session, what are their credentials? So as a professional compliance manager, you should be asking those questions of your business. So how well is it designed? So essentially the existence of the control, is it designed well? Is it very good, fair, poor? And how well is it performing? So this is where you actually look at the registers and see, has 100% of our new starters been given this induction training? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? And then choosing an answer commensurate with that. So very good, fair, poor. Okay, if it's designed at a very good level, if it's performing at a very good level, the effectiveness is strong. And then naturally, if your testing uncovers some not given the training, well, naturally the effectiveness drops. Okay, you can change this methodology. One of the features of the risk assessment platform, which I haven't mentioned today, is you can change the methodology and model. So I won't spend any more time. You've seen the risks, you've seen the controls, you've seen the report. There's so much more I can show you. Reach out to me. I'd love to give you a more detailed demonstration. Bill, do you want to do a quick poll before we cross over to Andrew?
Yeah, sure. And while I'm doing that, Ali, can you have a look at the question that's been posed on the question?
Let's have a look at the question. Does our library identify shared risks or controls between regulatory frameworks? Yes. So what we do in our controls library, we will tell you which domain it relates to. So for example, we'll give you a control and we'll say it relates to anti-money laundering. We'll give you a control and we'll say it relates to fraud. And there's some controls that have multiple uses, and it will list them against each of those different risk domains. So we've got a poll question that Bill's put up. How often do you conduct business level fraud risk assessments? So is it never? Is it annually? So every 12 months? Is it semi-annually, every 6 months? Is it biannually, which means every 2 years, or even less frequently than 2 years? So please answer one of those questions. We'll give you a minute or so.
So this to fill the dead air, Ali, there's another question's come in.
And there's another one. Let me have a look. And then, sorry, I lost that second poll question. Do you want to read it out, Bill?
Oh, so the question, how does this tool work within the 3 lines of defence model?
Great. So I'll let you answer those questions, and then I'm going to let us know, Bill, when you're ready to share the results.
Is that right? Got them there?
Yeah, I can see them. I might let you know. So only a few of you said never, which is great. But if you do them never, please reach out to us. We can help you. It's pretty simple to set one up. Annually, which is great. Semi-annually, which is fantastic. If you're doing them every 6 months, I would suggest that's the benchmark. And biannually, so which means every couple of years, I suggest it's probably not enough. So reach out to us. Would love to find out how you're doing them. And the next question is, I can't see. Oh, yeah. How does the tool work within the 3 line of defense model? Is there answers to that, or is that a free text answer, Bill?
Yeah, that's a question for you.
There's a question for me.
Ali, sorry to interrupt, but that's my first slide, so I can answer that after you introduce me.
There we go.
Great. Well, let's do that. I'm going to quickly introduce Andrew, and then we'll hand over to Andrew. Andrew is a governance, risk, and compliance advisor and general manager. He's a virtual chief risk officer. Andrew is highly credentialed and experienced in risk. He has consulted and advised to major financial institutions, and I can vouch for that. I know a lot of Australia's major financial institutions that have brought Andrew in to provide consulting one way or another. Government bodies, greenfield startups, fintechs. And during that time, Andrew's developed a pragmatic and practical way of risk culture and to embed, solve, and understand the benefits of GRC within a business. Okay, over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ali. I'm just going to share the screen. Okay. Let me know if you can see that. So it should be the 3 lines of defense model.
Can't see it yet, Andrew. I can't see it.
Let's have a look. Share, just hang on.
There we go.
Okay, sorry. All right, thank you everybody for having me here. Thank you, Bill, Ali, and Mia. I guess I'll answer that question first, which is how the 3 lines of defence model and the tool sort of fit together. Most people would know this fairly, ingrained in them if they're doing risk. It's always good to start off from here. But if you haven't,
just to interrupt you for a sec, you're sharing a screen, but we're not actually seeing anything.
Oh, really?
You need to select one of those. You'll get a number of options to select to share.
Sorry, because it's.
This is the joy of the pandemic. So the pandemic has. I don't think we've seen a presentation yet in the last 18 months where someone's either on mute and talking or trying to share and hasn't been able to share. So it's pretty normal.
There we go.
Apologies, everyone. So this model or this 3 lines of defence, that should be fairly standard for everyone who works in a risk function, regardless of whether it's siloed to fraud, whether it's siloed to operational risk, credit risk, or a more broader governance, risk and compliance. I guess the best way to have a look at this to answer that question around how RAP will fit into this is if we have a look at some of those functions, and obviously this isn't all of them, but this is a very high level view, is that you can see that some of the business level risks in the first line of defence will actually, is actually based on what Ali was talking about there in regards to your own assessment of a risk, your own assessment of the controls and how you're managing that. It then goes up to the second line of defence, which is the review and challenge. And of course, because they've been put into the system, you would then be able to review those, rate those, I'll say challenge those, but maybe have a look at them and see if there are additional, additional controls, a change in controls, tightening of controls to move it from one level of control, a lesser effectiveness, to a more effective level of control. And then obviously, or I won't say obviously, but then the next piece of that is reporting upwards. So whether that's to the board, various committees, externally, as we all know, there's external, I guess, obligations that we may have to independent auditors in various guises. So the system is very, or a system, and in particular the RAP one, is very good at being able to manage those and provide that at a point in time for the various sort of levels of lines of defence. And we have talked about financial crime, and I wanted to, I guess, highlight that while financial crime is the main topic of today, in a broader sense, if you see here and this is just a generic risk management framework, AML, CTF, financial crime or fraud would fit broadly into financial crime risk, and perhaps operational risk from an AML or KYC point of view. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I've used RAP not just for the financial crime, not just for AML and its associated policies and processes and assessments that have been discussed today, but I've started to use it in a number of different areas of material risk. And as you can see, and building on what Adam said before, it's very busy, this slide, and that really highlights the amount of touching that a governance, risk and compliance professional needs to do. It's not just the financial crime, it's also liquidity risk. It's not just KYC, it's credit risk as well. So if we broaden it out, and obviously that's what RAP is doing, these frameworks and assessments can be put into each of those. Now, what I currently liken today too is, and apologies for the people who don't remember or aren't old enough to have been around, but about 30 years ago, I was in sort of a credit risk role, and we were moving from pieces of paper where you would fill out, in writing, you would fill out a credit assessment, you would get a report, but it was a report where you had to call up and they would tell you over the phone, and you would have to write it down on this piece of paper, and that was the credit assessment. At that time, we had no, I'll say like an automated credit engine. We had no scorecards. We had no systems where you could even put in information. It was all on a folder with work in it. So we were moving from that to a system, and today I believe that's what's happening with risk and compliance, where we're still using, and even though you could say that it is more automated than a book with a register in it, etc. We have spreadsheets, we have Excels, we have documents that we can share, etc. I still believe we're probably only at a point in time where we're automating about 5% of what we could automate. Now, realistically, even some of the simple things that Ali has shown us, we could move that 5% of Excel spreadsheets, libraries with policies in them, registers, etc. Some, automated reporting that's based on some data that you put into a spreadsheet. We could move that easily to about 40 to 50% just with the simple things that Ali has shown in the wrap product. And by that, I mean, what you would be looking at is an assessment, let's say on credit risk, which actually details what are the things that are appropriate risks for that area. There would be some questions which would then identify the controls that are being used, and then of course the effectiveness of each one of those. So therefore, what you would then have is you would have a view of that credit risk department or that credit risk for your particular department, area, company, etc. I guess the other good thing that it does from that point of view is it makes things transparent, and it also gives an avenue to provide a handoff to the appropriate people. The other thing that I wanted to talk about quickly as well is around this, once you get the assessment, how are you assured that the assessment is the same as an assessment somebody else in the department has done? And what I mean by that, we've all used the saying, and we've used various sayings today, but the squeaky wheel gets the grease or the oil. And I believe that's very similar in the GRC environment today. Somebody who is on the ball for their department, who raises the issues, who isn't afraid to raise that there is an issue in their department from a risk and compliance point of view, can often get the capital investment, the money, the resources, the time to solve their problems. Now, if you're not that type of person, if you're not forthcoming, if you won't be able to identify those risks to the same level and raise it to the right people, then what happens is you might not get those resources, which means, as you can see, your risk will increase. You won't have the ability to then resolve those risks or remedy those risks, and it can become a downward spiral. So by having these questions, which are very specific questions, very yes or no questions, then what it does is it will identify at that top level of assurance, you will be able to report apples with apples. So it's not based on somebody being louder, being more vocal, being, having their resources to be able to deep dive, while somebody might be starved of that. They might not be as loud, and therefore they will then, as I said, continually go into this decline of less and less resources, more and more risk, and less ability to identify that risk and raise it at the right levels. So it's also an evening platform as well.
Andrew,
sorry, Ali. Yeah.
We've received a good question. So we might not have time for a full Q&A panel, but we have received a great question that Adam and Andrew may will be able to answer, and that is, has anyone on the panel got first-hand experience in actually identifying fraud? What led to that suspicion? And any tips to fraud spotting? I'll just quickly give you the example I shared earlier, and that is just as part of standard governance procedures, and with the sort of increased availability of KYC, so know your customer tools, where you put in a name of a business, and quickly you can establish the owners of that business, regardless of how many companies are in that structure. If you get a list of your suppliers and you run them through a KYC provider, you can get the names of the ultimate owners of those suppliers and compare them to any other database, including your employee database, and see if there's common ownerships. And then in doing so, I've seen fraud identified. And that was at my time, for example, at Equifax. But Adam and Andrew, are there any others that you'd like to share in terms of sort of anonymized examples of fraud you've seen? And apologies, guys, we might go over time by a few minutes, but if you can stay with us, it'd be fantastic. No?
Yep, I'm happy to speak to that quickly. So we've certainly, as part of the risk assessment process that we run, we use an analytics suite where we have various scripts we use. And one particular example I can think of was when we were looking at accounts payable, and basically we, as part of the review of the analytics data that came through, we found multiple addresses, telephone numbers, bank account details. That's the classic 101 accounts payable fraud type, right? And that was part of a risk assessment process. And we identified a fraud. I can't remember the value of it. I think it was sub 100,000, but it was still, it's an example of, you know, going through the process of doing a proper risk assessment. And the new standard AS 8001 talks about pressure testing, which we haven't spoken about before. And it's, in essence, it's the same thing. It could be data analytics, or it could be, you know, putting a fake transaction through to test a control. So there's some guidance around that in the new standard, which is worthwhile looking at.
Thanks, Adam. Andrew, anything else you want to add before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a simple one, which is one from the credit point of view, because obviously that's my real background, is that usually first non-payers, they're usually frauds. So you can usually have a look at those, and you could get some, you know, some analytics around what looks like a fraud if you keep on reviewing your first non-payers.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, look, I think that people should remember is that it's been shown time and time again that your front line of defense for fraud in a lot of businesses is your staff. Staff awareness and staff training is absolutely key. And I think that was one of your controls that you talked about earlier, Ali. It simply cannot be overlooked. Constant staff awareness is really significant. And it depends, of course, if you're a sophisticated ADI, you'll have all sorts of software running in the background, checking for things, checking for first payments and for, you know, missed first payments and things like that. If you're a pub with poker machines, it's your staff. And, you know, anywhere in between, it's absolutely crucial. So look, I think that's probably wraps it up. Thanks everybody for staying. Thanks, Ali. It was great. If there are any further questions or anybody's got anything else that they'd like to know, you've all got my email address, and I'll be sending a follow-up email out very shortly. Get in touch with me. I'll pass any questions on to the panel. And when we get the chance, I'll be sharing the recording with you as well. So thanks very much. Thanks, Mia, who's been sitting in the background monitoring all of this and making sure it all worked, and who's the driving force behind the whole thing. Mia, thanks very much for your participation. I much appreciate it. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Adam. And thanks again, Ali. See you all later.